Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Stories, a cozy corner where gentle bedtime stories and peaceful moments come together to help you drift off with ease. Tonight, we invite you to settle in for another comforting narrative, one crafted to help you unwind and find a sense of calm. But first, let's take a moment to prepare both body and mind for a soothing night's rest. Find a relaxed position, and with each slow inhale and gentle exhale, allow the day's cares to quietly slip away. It can be challenging to step away from the day's busyness, especially as bedtime nears. However, remember, the less we worry about falling asleep, the easier it is for our minds to release any lingering tension. Let the gentle rhythm of your breathing wash away any concerns and allow tonight's tale to guide you into a deeper state of relaxation. Now, settle in and let the tranquil atmosphere of sleepy stories surround you. Enjoy this story, and may your night be restful and restorative. Once upon a time, there lived a merchant named Laurent who had invested all his wealth in a fleet of ships only to see them lost to the vast ocean. As a widower, he didn't have to break the heartbreaking news to a wife, but he did bear the weight of informing his 6 children who were accustomed to a life filled with luxury. When the debts loomed and word spread that the family was in dire straits, the news hit them hard. Each day passed without any sign of the ships, forcing Laurent to begin selling their treasured possessions, fine furniture, their elegant carriage, and even his daughter's beautiful jewelry and exquisite dresses. They eventually had to leave their opulent home behind and move into a modest cottage on the outskirts of town. Laurent often found himself away from home, searching for new investments and partners to help restore his business. Meanwhile, his 3 sons and 3 daughters, most of whom were nearly grown yet lacking practical skills, were left to manage the household on their own. While the older siblings struggled to adjust to their new circumstances, Camille, the youngest daughter, embraced her responsibilities with enthusiasm, learning how to keep a home running smoothly without servants. Camille was well loved in the village and sought guidance from her neighbors on baking, sewing, gardening, and caring for chickens. Her eagerness to learn and her diligent work ethic endeared her to everyone around her. Gradually, she became the glue that held Laurent's family together. As her older siblings navigated this challenging new reality, Camille made sure their home was tidy and that meals were always ready. Nearly 2 years into this new way of life came wonderful news. One of Laurent's lost ships had returned to port with most of its cargo still intact. The family rejoiced at this miraculous turn of events. While her older siblings were eager to leave their humble life among the villagers behind, Camille found joy in their cozy cottage, adorned with its tidy garden and filled with the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread. Though she was delighted to see her family so happy again, she felt uncertain about returning to their previous life of extravagance. In her heart, she had discovered a newfound sense of fulfillment in being helpful and cherished. To reclaim his possessions, Laurent embarked on a horseback journey to the port, a trek that would span several days. Once he arrived, he would oversee the fair distribution of his regained wealth and hire a cozy coach for his return home. Eagerly anticipating their improved fortunes, he asked each of his children what gift they wished for from the city. The older siblings requested lavish items, silk shoes adorned with sparkling buckles, intricately decorated hats, sumptuous velvet capes, cuddly bears, and dazzling jewels. Only Camille remained quiet, lost in thought about her own desires. When her father gently encouraged her to share, she paused for a moment before replying, "Father, I have always dreamed of seeing a rose. They are rare and expensive in our area." She expressed her wish for just one rose in any color she could find delightful. Her father chuckled at the unique request of his youngest child, but readily agreed to fulfill it. In his heart, he also decided to surprise her with a necklace or some other small treasure to accompany the flower. The morning of his departure dawned beautifully. Camille took great care in packing his saddlebag with provisions for the journey and bid him farewell with a bittersweet smile that glistened with unshed tears. The older siblings were more casual about their father's trip. They were used to his travels and were solely focused on the gifts they hoped to receive upon his return. As Laurent rode away along the sun-dappled forest path, Camille stood alone in front of their cottage until he disappeared from view. A peculiar unease settled within her, yet she chose to keep it to herself. After all, it seemed their fortunes were finally on an upswing. While Laurent's children waited patiently at home, he made steady progress toward the port city, filled with hope of recovering what was rightfully his. It was true that he had faced considerable losses. However, with the cargo aboard the ship, he envisioned starting anew, perhaps even establishing a fleet of ships in time. His mind danced with dreams of importing spices, silks, and other exquisite goods in the future. Thus, it was a heavy blow when he arrived, only to find his dreams dashed. Indeed, the ship had returned, bringing with it most of its cargo intact. Yet, news of this fortunate turn had spread like wildfire, prompting his many creditors to take swift action. By the time Laurent arrived to reclaim his belongings, they had already been dispersed to pay off his numerous debts. Despite his attempts to negotiate extensions with various merchants regarding his substantial bills, he found no success. As the day drew to a close, he found himself free of debt but utterly bereft of possessions. There were no funds left for him to invest, or even for the gifts he had promised his family. Overwhelmed by disappointment, he felt no desire to remain in the city for another night. Without properly preparing for the journey ahead, neglecting provisions, disregarding the weather, and failing to send any notice, Laurent mounted his weary horse and rode away from town, retracing the provincial road that had brought him to the port that very morning. A few hours into his journey, as darkness enveloped the land, a fierce storm erupted. Lightning flashed and thunder roared around him while the wind howled mercilessly, tearing branches from trees. Startled by the tumultuous weather, Laurent's horse bolted off the main road and plunged into an unfamiliar forest. Realizing too late how unwise it was to travel at night, Laurent began searching through the howling winds for any semblance of shelter, a cave, or a safe haven. He lost track of time as they wandered through the tempest, until finally, a tall stone wall loomed before him. With hope ignited within him, he urged his horse forward, wishing he had found a house where he could seek refuge. However, Upon reaching the imposing wall of rock, he discovered it encircled an estate rather than a home. Before him stood a grand iron gate that was ajar just enough for him to slip through. With little regard for propriety in such dire circumstances, Laurent dismounted and pushed open the heavy gate wider to lead his horse inside. Together, they made their way up a paved path that faded into the swirling darkness ahead. Leaves whipped around them and rain lashed down from all directions as Laurent strained to see through the murky gloom. Gradually, a massive structure took shape in front of him. It was unmistakably a mansion. Though his view was limited, he could discern the impressive facade of the building, boasting grand entrances and numerous spacious rooms adorned with tall windows. It felt like a daunting place for someone to arrive without an invitation, yet he had little choice in the matter. The thought of spending the night exposed to the elements filled him with dread. He needed shelter. After securing his horse in a sheltered nook, he approached the imposing front door and grasped the iron knocker. He let it fall, its echo reverberating through the dimness, almost as if it were answering the distant rumble of thunder. When no one responded, he inhaled deeply and leaned against the door, pushing it open with all his strength. To his surprise, it yielded easily, sending him stumbling into the vast entryway. Laurent paused on the chilly flagstones for a moment, catching his breath amid the eerie quiet that enveloped him. He could still hear the rain pelting against the front steps through a narrow gap in the towering door, and felt a wave of relief wash over him at having found refuge for his horse. Rising cautiously in the dim light, he took in his surroundings. The grand reception area featured a sweeping staircase rising gracefully on either side. Suits of armor stood like silent guardians throughout the space. Before him loomed a pair of intricately carved double doors. The silence within was profound, so deep that one might have heard a pin drop. Yet, a gentle glow emanated from beneath the doors ahead. Despite several tentative attempts to call out to anyone who might be inside, he finally summoned his courage and stepped toward the illuminated room, gently pushing open the doors. As he entered, he surveyed his new surroundings. A roaring fire danced in the expansive hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. A table set for one displayed an unpretentious selection of dishes alongside a carafe and a large glass waiting patiently to be filled. His gaze drifted around this inviting space, taking note of plush chairs and tables scattered with books, a cozy haven amidst the storm outside. Yet, there was no sign of the homeowner. Laurent settled awkwardly into one of the armchairs, waiting for a moment. The delightful aroma of the laid-out meal was too tempting to resist. He found himself captivated by the loaf of bread and the savory scent of roasted meat. As time passed without a soul in sight, his stomach let out a loud growl, urging him to give in to his hunger. He moved to the table, starting with a slice of bread and gradually indulging in the entire feast at a leisurely pace. An hour slipped by in peaceful silence, and he assumed that the owner must be away, seeking shelter from the storm elsewhere. Enjoying a deep sip from his glass filled with delicious liquid, he eagerly polished off the last remnants of dinner. Convinced that the homeowner was absent, Laurent reassured himself that he could explain his unexpected presence come morning. After savoring every bite, He reclined contentedly in his chair, finishing off the carafe. The crackling fire enveloped him in warmth as he drained the final drop from his glass and pulled out the letter regarding his recovered cargo ship from his pocket. Once filled with hope, his dreams had now faded away. With an unconscious gesture, he pushed the letter aside on the table and surrendered to a deep sleep. Throughout the night, he slumbered soundly without dreams. When morning arrived, it took him a moment to gather his bearings. The fire had long since died down, and remnants of last night's meal remained on the table. It appeared that the homeowner still had not returned. A wave of embarrassment washed over him for intruding into someone else's home. Overwhelmed by discomfort, Laurent decided it would be best to leave quietly rather than wait for the owner's return. Rationalizing that the untouched dinner would have gone uneaten anyway, he rose from his chair, crossed the room, and opened the double doors. Soft light filtered into the entryway, illuminating the stark hallway more clearly than it had been during the night. As he stepped cautiously into the foyer, it felt as if he were treading on eggshells among the watchful suits of armor, half expecting them to spring to life and block his path. His gaze swept over the grand twin staircases adorned with their neglected ornate carpet runners. An unsettling feeling lingered that this place had been uninhabited for quite some time. As he approached the grand front door, he grasped the handles firmly, summoning all his strength to pull it open slowly. Beyond the threshold lay a misty courtyard, shrouded in a soft haze. After stepping through and gently closing the door behind him, he adjusted his waistcoat, striving to regain his composure. Though a sense of unease washed over him at the thought of leaving the imposing mansion like a thief escaping into the night, he resolved to put this embarrassing episode behind him. Hastening back to the alcove where his horse had been tied the previous evening, he felt a wave of relief upon finding her safe and sound. From his saddlebag, he retrieved an apple, a leftover from Camille's thoughtful provisions, and offered it to the grateful creature. Untethering her gently, he led her quietly along the stone path that he had navigated through the blustery darkness just hours before. Casting a glance over his shoulder, he took in the mansion that loomed ominously as daylight began to break. The vast chateau stretched long and rectangular, with a central section flanked by matching wings on either side. Its tall, narrow windows lined both imposing floors in orderly rows, seemingly gazing down upon him. The grand structure was topped with a thickly chimneyed roof adorned with sloping tiles that added to its stately presence. Shaking off his thoughts of the formidable chateau, he directed his horse toward the front gate while observing the overgrown gardens that bordered his path. As he neared the end of the walkway, his eyes fell upon a charmingly wild pergola draped in blooming rose bushes. At its heart stood a circular seating area dominated by a rose bush bursting with the most exquisite pink blossoms he had ever encountered. Remembering his promise to Camille, his youngest daughter, he felt compelled to honor his word. With a knife from his bag in hand, he eagerly began snipping away at the delicate roses, intent on collecting them all as a symbol of his devotion. Engrossed in this task, he remained oblivious to the footsteps drawing near until he stepped back from the now bare bush and sensed someone watching him. Turning around, he was met with a stern gaze from an imposing figure. Though resembling a man, this being was distinguished by a wild mane of facial hair and an unusually tall and muscular build. Caught off guard and looking rather disheveled in hastily thrown on linen shirt and breeches, this figure appeared furious. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" he growled, his voice deep and menacing like that of a wolf. Laurent stood there, frozen in place, acutely aware of the bouquet he clutched in his left hand. He stammered out an explanation, insisting he thought the house was empty and that the roses would go unnoticed. But the man's fierce expression remained unchanged, prompting Laurent to weakly add that he had promised roses to his daughter. The man in the linen shirt, with an imposing presence, paused in silence, seemingly weighing his next words carefully. Standing tall, he pronounced, "You have taken advantage of my hospitality without permission. You ate and rested here, something I was willing to overlook. However, by stripping my beloved rose bush of its blooms, you have crossed a line. Each flower holds immense sentimental value for me. They are irreplaceable. You must find a way to make amends for this loss." Hearing this made Laurent's heart sink. He shook his head in defeat, admitting he had nothing to offer in return. The stern host regarded him with a frosty gaze. "In that case, you will need to work off your debt," he declared firmly. "I need laborers at my estate." Laurent gazed at him, trying to suggest an alternative. "But sir," he protested, "I have 6 children waiting for me at home. I cannot stay here. What will happen to them?" The man remained unyielding. "You will either work to repay your debt, or someone from your family must take your place," he insisted. "Take your roses. They no longer hold any value for me now," the man continued. "Return home and make arrangements. I expect either you or a substitute within a week. If you fail to appear, there will be consequences." With that final word, the stern man turned away without a backward glance. Laurent watched him disappear into the chateau, realizing he had no choice but to return home and prepare his children for his absence. Perhaps once the man calmed down, he might release Laurent from his obligation. As he rode steadily but slowly back home, he pondered how best to break the news. Despite the lovely day, the mist lifting and sunshine breaking through, his heart felt heavy with worry about what lay ahead. He arrived late that night to find his children eagerly awaiting him. After all, they were expecting gifts from their father's journey. As he opened and closed his saddlebags, they playfully reached around in anticipation of finding the treasures he'd promised them. With regret tugging at him, he instead handed each child a single rose. Camille took hers first and breathed in its sweet fragrance with delight, marveling at its beauty. However, his other 5 children were quick to demand their real presents instead. That evening, gathered around the bustling kitchen table, Laurent recounted the unfortunate events of his journey to the port city. He spoke of the loss of his remaining wealth and the circumstances that led him to owe a debt to the enigmatic owner of the distant chateau. As he finished explaining that he would need to return and work off what he owed, his 5 oldest children frowned in discontent. They voiced their concerns, questioning how they would manage without him. Only Camille remained quiet. She sat at the table with a thoughtful expression, her mind deep in contemplation. Finally, she called for silence, surprising her siblings, as she was not typically one to voice her thoughts. With calm determination, Camille declared that she would go to the chateau in place of her father. Laurent's eyes brimmed with tears as he protested vehemently against her decision. Yet, Camille's reasoning was hard to dispute. Their father needed to stay home to support the family. She could be spared. Besides, she possessed some skills around the house and could handle any cleaning or cooking duties assigned to her. Ultimately, she concluded that there was no other viable option. She would be the one to work off their family's debt. Camille took a day or two to prepare her few belongings for the journey ahead. As the rose her father had given her began to fade, she pressed it between the pages of a book to preserve it. This way, she would have a cherished reminder of why she was leaving behind everything familiar to work for a stranger at an isolated estate. Though nervous about departing from all she had known, Camille was resolute in her desire to make her father proud. The morning of Camille's departure arrived bright and clear. She and Laurent loaded her possessions into a small cart hitched to their loyal mare. The chateau lay 2 days' journey away with the horse pulling the cart, and Laurent knew of an inn where they could rest for the night along their route. Her 4 remaining siblings gathered outside their cottage to bid them farewell. Among them lingered a blend of relief and unspoken admiration. They felt grateful that they wouldn't be left alone for too long. The journey was solemn for both Laurent and Camille. The pleasant weather accompanied them throughout their first day, and their night at the inn passed without incident. On the second day of their journey, the weather turned blustery and grim as autumn began to weave its way through the forest. Brown leaves, the first victims of the season, danced along their path while the wind sang a mournful tune through the trees. Their trusty mare plodded steadily down the road, drawing them closer to an impending farewell. When Laurent spotted the turnoff leading to the chateau, a heaviness settled in his heart with every step. Sensing her father's melancholy, Camille gathered her courage and flashed him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, father," she said gently. "I can handle this. I will be just fine." He nodded, hoping her optimism would hold true. At last, they arrived at the dreary entrance of the estate. Laurent understood that the moment had come. He pushed open the gate once more, guiding their horse through and approaching the imposing mansion for a second time. Camille stared in awe at what lay before her. The sprawling, overgrown gardens and the towering, uninviting walls of the house were beyond anything she had ever encountered. It was both daunting and captivating in its darkness. Having grown up in a village, Camille felt overwhelmed by the sheer size of it all, acutely aware of its air of mystery and permanence. The stones seemed to slumber deeply, as if patiently waiting for someone to uncover their secrets. She contemplated the tasks that awaited her within those walls, hoping they would be within her reach. Bringing the horse and cart to a halt at the wide front steps, Laurent braced himself against the wind that seemed determined to push them away from this threshold. They climbed slowly up the steps. Laurent lifted the heavy door knocker and let it fall with a resounding thud. Father and daughter stood there on the steps, awaiting the appearance of the stern master of this grand house. To their surprise, when the door creaked open, it revealed a boy who appeared to be about 13 years old, dressed simply in village clothing. He peered out at them with curiosity before nodding in apparent approval. "Are one of you here as the new servant?" he asked. Laurent was momentarily taken aback, but explained that he had brought his daughter Camille to work off his debt in his stead. The boy nodded knowingly as if this were entirely expected and pulled open the door wider, inviting her inside. With that, the voice scurried away into the shadows of the house, likely to inform others that the new servant had arrived, buoyed by the wind at her back. Camille stepped through the threshold and into her new existence. It was a poignant farewell for both Laurent and Camille, yet they each wore a mask of bravery. The loyal mare turned towards home, the heavy clouds pressing down upon them, not glancing back until they had passed through the gates of the chateau. Only then did the rustling trees of the forest close in behind them. Camille stood hesitantly in the vast hallway, its echoes amplifying her uncertainty. The muted light from the overcast sky filtered through tall windows above the door, but it did little to imbue warmth into the space. She stifled a shiver and inched closer to the trunk containing her belongings. Reminding herself to summon her courage, she resolved to make the best of this new chapter. Moments later, a boy dashed back into the hall, eagerly informing her that the Baron had instructed him to show her to her room. With that, he cheerfully hoisted her trunk and began to haul it up the grand curving staircase. Camille followed him, taken aback that they were ascending rather than descending to a kitchen or lower quarters. Perhaps she would be staying in an attic room. To her astonishment, as they traversed the opulent carpet of the east wing, the boy turned down a magnificent hallway. Their quiet footsteps echoed past portraits of long-gone nobles who seemed to gaze down upon them with unblinking eyes, as if this peculiar girl were an uninvited guest in their timeless abode. So captivated was Camille by their stares that she nearly bumped into him when he abruptly halted before a door and swung it open. Stepping inside after him, Camille gasped at what she beheld. It was undoubtedly the most exquisite bedroom she had ever encountered. While not excessively large and adorned with modest furnishings, it featured a canopied bed draped in fine fabrics and rich wooden accents that exuded luxury. As she took in her surroundings, spotting a snug window seat and a petite dressing table, the boy set about lighting a fire in the grate. Once it crackled warmly to life, he brushed off his hands and flashed her a grin. "I'm Gabriel," he introduced himself cheerfully. "I assist the Baron with various tasks around here. I'm truly glad you're here. It can get rather lonely at times, and I could use some help with daily chores." Camille hesitated on how to reply, while curiosity about what those daily tasks entailed flickered in her mind. She simply thanked him for starting the fire and inquired when she might have the chance to meet her new employer. Gabriel gently conveyed to her that the Baron had expressed his intention to meet with her the following day to clarify her responsibilities. For the moment, he would be bringing her a modest supper, hoping she would find peace and rest for the night. Then, just as quickly as he had come, Gabriel slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. Taking a deep breath, Camille set about unpacking her belongings. She hung her garments in the spacious wardrobe and carefully arranged her few books on a side table beside the bed. As she opened one of the volumes, a delicate pink rose fell from between its pages, eliciting a bittersweet smile from her. After closing the book and placing it aside, she made her way to the window, pulled back the heavy curtains, and nestled into the soft cushions of the window seat. From this vantage point, she could gaze out over the courtyard where wild gardens meandered along winding paths and climbed up the stone walls of the chateau. As dusk settled in, a gentle breeze stirred debris across the cobblestones, creating little whirlwinds that danced about. Dark clouds hurried past as they raced toward the rising moon. Exhausted from her journey and still adjusting to her new surroundings, she soon found herself drifting off within the embrace of the curtains. A gentle knock on her door stirred her awake. Unraveling herself from the cozy nook of the window seat, she took a moment to steady her breathing before opening the door to find a tray waiting outside. It held a simple meal of bread, cheese, soup, and hot tea. Scanning the hallway revealed no one in sight. It was clear that Gabriel was quite adept at moving silently. She brought the tray inside and set it down on a small table near the flickering fireplace. Starving after her travels, she savored each bite with delight. Skipping any elaborate bedtime rituals, she pulled back the coverlet and slipped into the inviting warmth of her sheets and pillow before quickly surrendering to sleep. Throughout the night, Camille was visited by strange dreams. She found herself wandering through shadowy corridors of the chateau, following a large dog that would vanish into various rooms, only to reappear moments later in front of her. Eager to catch up with it, she arrived at a doorway just as it disappeared. Peeking into that room, however, there was no dog in sight, only a man seated at a desk with his back turned toward her. Just as he began to turn around in his chair to face her, she jolted awake. Sitting up in bed, she noticed that only embers remained in the fireplace while sunlight streamed warmly through her window. As her initial bewilderment faded, a gentle knock echoed at her door. Gabriel stood there with a tray in hand. "Good morning, Miss Milla," he said with a polite smile. "I've brought you some breakfast." He gestured vaguely towards the entrance and added, "The Baron would like to see you in his study once you're done." Camille nodded at the young boy, accepted the tray, and watched as he quietly slipped away. An hour later, Camille found herself standing anxiously at the door of the very room where her father had once enjoyed his secret fireside meal. Inside, she could hear the soft rustle of papers. Clearing her throat, she knocked gently on the door. The sound ceased, followed by the scraping of a chair against the floor. Soon after, a man with an abundance of facial hair appeared before her. His features were quite striking in an unappealing way, and his face bore a natural frown that was rather intimidating. Nevertheless, Camille masked her unease and offered a polite nod in greeting. The large man scrutinized her for a moment before returning her nod with an awkward tilt of his head. He then motioned for her to take a seat in a chair by the warm fire. With that, he settled into the armchair across from her. "Understand that you are tasked with settling your father's debt," he said. "Do you know how to handle basic household chores like cleaning and cooking?" Camille nodded, confirming her familiarity with these tasks. The man seemed satisfied by her response. he picked up a hefty ring of keys from a nearby table. "As you can see, I am quite short on assistants here," he remarked. "Gabriel looks after my essential needs, while his mother ensures I have bread, milk, and eggs each day, and he runs errands into town. Yet, there is no one else to oversee the estate except for me. You can likely see that just by glancing around. It may be overwhelming for only you and Gabriel, but we will manage." He paused as if anticipating a response. Camille was taken aback by the thought of being the sole housekeeper in this vast mansion, yet she felt it pointless to voice her concerns. The man continued, "These keys will unlock most of the rooms in the house, though many of them may not require your attention. If you need anything that Gabriel cannot provide, please ask me directly. Otherwise, I prefer that you make as many decisions about the household as you can on your own. I spend most of my time in my study or the library." Feeling daunted by the magnitude of her new responsibilities, Camille could only nod, signaling the end of their conversation. He stood up abruptly. She rose from her chair, accepted the ancient keys from him with a nod, and as she turned to leave the room, he called out to her, "Dinner is at 7 p.m. It would be wise for you to join me in the dining room." Camille nodded again, expressed her gratitude, and exited the study. In the expansive front hall, she paused momentarily, feeling both lost within its grandeur and somewhat overwhelmed by its presence. She spread the heavy keys across her open palm and gazed at them thoughtfully. Though she was unsure which doors they unlocked, they exuded a quiet sense of authority. Her contemplation was interrupted when Gabriel emerged from the shadows. With a bright grin directed at her, he asked if she would like a tour. Gratefully accepting his offer, Camille's journey as the housekeeper at the chateau began anew. What Camille discovered was that the employer lived in solitude, having done so for many long years. His formidable appearance instilled fear in those around him, leading them to share unkind tales and treat him with disdain whenever he ventured into public. Gabriel was the sole link he had to the outside world. He had begun by running errands for the Baron many years ago, but over time, he had come to admire and respect the man hidden behind the stern exterior. He reassured Camille that the Baron's growl was far worse than his actual nature. Each day, Gabriel devoted himself to tending to the house, ensuring that all necessary tasks were completed. At nightfall, he would return to his family's modest home on the outskirts of town. "Honestly, miss," he affirmed, "the Baron is a just and compassionate soul." Gabriel then guided Camille through the vast array of rooms and corridors within the chateau, most of which were showing signs of neglect. In the shadowy hallways lay unused bedrooms draped in dusty sheets. The once warm fireplaces stood cold, with some chambers left untouched for decades or even centuries. Furniture and belongings were piled high in these forgotten spaces, shrouded in cobwebs. The windows struggled to admit light from outside, obscured by layers of grime that had gathered over the years. As Camille explored her new surroundings, she soon realized that only a handful of rooms were regularly used, and it was her task to clean and organize them. These included the kitchen, the Baron's study, and the entrance hall. Yet, the most breathtaking of all was the library. Gabriel kindly allowed Camille a glimpse into this enchanting space while the Baron was otherwise occupied, and she was left in awe of what lay before her. The library was vast, with soaring ceilings adorned in gold accents. Towering bookcases stretched from floor to ceiling along every wall, save for where the windows graced the room with natural light. Rolling ladders stood ready at either end, poised to glide across the shelves and grant access to any book within reach. Countless volumes filled the shelves, their spines boasting hues of crimson, forest green, navy blue, and brown, each one inviting her to pick it up and delve into its pages. Camille, who had cherished the few books she managed to read during her father's financial struggles, had never encountered such an extraordinary collection. Gabriel mentioned that the Baron spent a considerable amount of time here, and it certainly seemed that way. Throughout this lavish sanctuary, tables overflowed with books open to various pages or stacked together thoughtfully, while well-worn leather armchairs suggested countless hours spent immersed in reading. Gabriel gravely informed her that he would always ensure the fire burned brightly in the grate during daylight hours. Camille imagined what it would be like to select one of these many volumes and settle into a plush chair, inhaling the rich aroma of aged paper infused with ink. It felt utterly magical. She understood that if she wanted to make progress in this neglected house, she would need to choose a spot and begin. On that first day, she and Gabriel dusted off and aired out the front hall before tidying up the kitchen. Gabriel and the Baron had been preparing simple meals there for quite some time. However, much of the space needed care. While Camille wasn't a culinary expert by any means, she took delight in restoring the kitchen's former brilliance. She sent Gabriel into town with a shopping list before setting to work in the grand yet quiet kitchen. Countertops were cleared of dust, pots and pans gleamed once more, and slowly but surely the cold emptiness began to pulse with life again. By the time dinner rolled around with the Baron, Camille had prepared a humble meal of roasted chicken. It may not have been extravagant, but she felt a sense of pride in her accomplishment. With little time to prepare, Camille hurried back to her room. Gabrielle had rekindled the fire, and she took a moment to freshen up at her washstand before slipping into her finest dress. As she approached the window to close the curtains for the night, she paused, gazing out into the enveloping darkness. The courtyard was quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation. Not a single creature stirred. Even the birds seemed to have settled down for the evening. The grounds were wrapped in a tranquil hush. With a gentle tug, she pulled the velvet curtains together and reluctantly turned away from the window. There was so much yet to explore in this place, she thought. Lighting a candle, she ventured down the softly lit hallway and descended the grand staircase. Before her stood the tall doors of the dining room. The space felt remarkably lavish for just 2 guests. It had surely hosted splendid gatherings and lavish feasts in times past. As she looked up, Camille admired the dazzling crystal chandelier that hung above like a constellation of stars. At one end of the long table, Gabriel had set 2 places, and dinner awaited her arrival. She was the first to enter. Her wait was brief. Soon after, the Baron's imposing figure appeared in the doorway. He paused for a moment and gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement. He then gestured toward the 2 place settings, inviting her to sit down. Camille gladly sank into one of the plush chairs. "I see you and Gabriel have been quite busy today," remarked the Baron, raising an eyebrow at the hearty meal laid out before them. "He has shouldered quite a burden as my only assistant these past years. I'm delighted you'll be here to help share some of his responsibilities." Camille nodded, feeling uncertain about how to respond. "You are my lord," she began hesitantly, but he shook his head gently. "Please, you may simply call me Antoine," he replied with a wry smile. "I am lord of nothing now, just this chateau and its collection of dusty relics," he added with a hint of humor in his voice. Looking deep into her eyes, he said gently, "I regret the circumstances that have led you here, but I hope you can find solace. I aim to be just, and I am truly glad to have your company." Camille nodded and offered a brief smile in response. "Would you like me to tidy up the library tomorrow?" she asked. "I wasn't certain if you would want me to go in." After a moment's reflection, the Baron agreed with a nod, signaling that it was indeed permissible. He then added, "Feel free to borrow any book that catches your interest from the library. As Descartes wisely noted, reading good books is like conversing with the greatest minds of history. You'll find my collection quite remarkable, filled with every title you could imagine. It's rather enchanting in that way." Surprised by his kind gesture and refined manner, Camille watched her somewhat melancholic employer as he dined. Having spent only a day at the chateau, her outlook on her situation had already begun to transform. She now realized she was the mistress of a magnificent estate, enjoying the freedom to work as she wished, while being granted access to an extensive library. Perhaps this unexpected turn of events wouldn't be as disheartening as she had initially feared. Lost in thought as she contemplated her meal in the flickering light of the fire, all she could hear was the gentle clinking of silverware against china. Throughout dinner, Camille and the Baron spoke little, finishing their meal in respectful silence. Later, nestled comfortably beneath the crisp white sheets of her opulent canopy bed, Camille felt a sense of hope blossom within her. This secluded estate held many fascinating secrets, and she looked forward to uncovering them in time. Rolling onto her side, she sleepily admired the tightly drawn drapes that shielded her from the darkness outside. Inside the chateau, a fire flickered warmly, its glow wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. The next day, after tidying up the kitchen, Camille made her way cautiously to the library. Knowing that the Baron was busy in his study, provided her with an opportunity to explore the splendid collection of books while pretending to clean. With a duster in hand, she carefully navigated around the shelves and tables, taking care of surfaces that had long been neglected by dust. Just as she was about to rearrange a stack of books, Antoine appeared in the doorway. "Kindly avoid disturbing any of the stacks or opening the books," he gently asked. Camille, feeling a bit guilty, took a step back from the pile she had inadvertently touched. "There's no need for apologies," he comforted her. "I realize it might appear a bit chaotic. I'm in the midst of some research and would hate to misplace my notes." He then asked if she had chosen a book for herself. She admitted that she hadn't and requested any recommendations he might have. Camille shared her feelings of inadequacy, expressing that she struggled to appreciate the depth of such significant works, given her less formal education compared to his. Antoine smiled warmly, gesturing broadly as he said, acknowledging one's ignorance is the first step on the path to wisdom. Noticing her confusion, he playfully winked and added that this bit of wisdom was attributed to Socrates. Moving across the room, he carefully retrieved a small book from a lower shelf and handed it to her. Perhaps you'll find joy in some of his other thoughts. He was a firm believer in the importance of asking questions. Camille accepted the book with a grateful nod. Just as she was about to leave the room, she paused and indicated that she did have a question after all. "Is it possible for me to hire some villagers to tidy up the gardens before winter?" she asked. Antoine looked at her with a hint of sadness and shrugged. "If Gabriel can find anyone willing to come onto the estate, you may do so. Sadly, most are reluctant to step onto the chateau grounds due to the wild stories that have circulated about me over the years, leaving me somewhat isolated." Camille frowned at this revelation. "How do you cope with it? Doesn't it frustrate you to be treated so unfairly?" Le Baron gazed down thoughtfully before responding. "I was once a more handsome yet vain and foolish man. It took a great misfortune for me to recognize my errors and understand the disdain people have for me now. Perhaps this is simply retribution for my past mistakes." Camille fell silent, choosing not to ask any further questions that day, but feeling determined to learn more about how her employer had ended up in such a difficult situation. For now, she looked forward to exploring Socrates' writings in her room after dinner. Camille quickly adapted to her new role as housekeeper at the chateau and even began to cherish it. With some persuasion, she managed to convince Gabrielle to hire a few local men who came one day and cleared away years of neglect from the gardens. This was only after Camille gave them strict instructions not to harm the rosebush near the pergola, as it had been planted by Antoine's mother and held deep sentimental value for him. She nearly regretted inviting the men from the village into her home when she overheard their cruel remarks about Antoine. "He's an absolute monster," one of them declared loudly to his companion. "He lives like a beast in there," another chimed in, "with no manners and unfit for human company. But I'll gladly take his money," he concluded with a sneer. Camille caught sight of Antoine by the window, absorbing every word of their harsh conversation. In a rush, she moved to close the window, eager to protect him from their unkindness. He waved her off, appearing unfazed by their words. "I've grown used to such talk," he replied. "It has been many years since I could mingle with society." Still troubled, Camille questioned him. "How can you endure such injustice? They don't even know you. How do you not despise them?" Antoine shrugged as he contemplated a stack of books on a nearby table. A brilliant English playwright named William Shakespeare once penned, "There is no furnace so hot for your foe that it does not burn yourself by holding goodwill toward these ignorant souls. I lighten my own burden by doing so." With a gentle smile and a nod towards Camille, he added, "You might enjoy reading Shakespeare yourself. He crafted some remarkable plays." Then he returned his attention to his books, leaving Camille to reflect on his words and the dreary weather outside. Despite the endless tasks awaiting her each day, Camille still found moments to wander through the house. As autumn arrived with its crisp air, early dusk, and chilly nights, she would meander through the corridors with a flickering candle in hand, using her heavy ring of keys to unlock the numerous closed doors lining the halls. Most rooms turned out to be bedrooms, suggesting that this grand chateau had once welcomed many esteemed guests from noble backgrounds. Covered in dust sheets, each darkened room revealed elegant four-poster beds, exquisite furniture, and chairs draped in fabric that had long been untouched. One day, she stumbled upon what appeared to be a particularly special chamber. It was unmistakably a lady's room, different from the others, and still filled with remnants of her life. A graceful dressing table showcased jars of powder alongside sparkling perfume bottles glinting in the afternoon light. Nearby stood elaborate wigs from years gone by, poised on their own stands as if patiently waiting for an upcoming grand ball. As Camille opened the wardrobe, she was taken aback to discover a collection of exquisite silk dresses from the pre-revolution era. With great care, she brushed her fingers over their fragile skirts, almost afraid that her touch might cause them to crumble away. Imagining the graceful lady who once wore these garments, the room seemed to shimmer with echoes of the past. When she turned her attention to the chest of drawers, she found it brimming with sparkling necklaces. Nestled within a small velvet box was a ring embellished with a glimmering sapphire. Camille gently closed the container, careful not to give the impression of taking anything for herself. With a heavy heart, she left the room and secured it once again. It felt like a portal to brighter days and was undoubtedly the most enchanting sight she had ever encountered in the house. Camille diligently penned letters to her father, which Gabriel would carry into town during his errands. In these letters, she reassured him that she was being treated kindly and enjoyed her work. Eventually, she even began sending him some money. After her first month, the Baron informed her that he could not allow her to work without compensation, since she had more than compensated for the damage done to the rose bush. He expressed his wish for her to remain and offered her a weekly salary for her contributions, which Camille gladly accepted. As Antoine's housekeeper, she felt as though she had discovered her true purpose. Her knack for organization flourished, and the delightful company, along with access to his remarkable library, became her greatest sources of joy. Though Antoine was often deemed unattractive, nothing about him had truly changed except that Camille took care to ensure his clothing was neat and presentable. Occasionally, when he passed by or during their conversations, she would catch a glimpse of a handsome man in the mirror, a fleeting image where he appeared less rugged and his features seemed more balanced. Yet, after blinking and refocusing, she would find herself staring at the same formidable-looking man as before. It felt as if the dark enchantment of the chateau was playing tricks on her perception. With a touch of ironic humor, she noted that sometimes a beggar would appear at their door, blissfully unaware of the estate's infamous reputation in her village. Typically, beggars were turned away and seldom received help. The townspeople's attitude suggested they believed those in need deserved their fate, and that hard-working individuals wouldn't find themselves in such unfortunate situations. Camille had expected Antoine to send them away, but to her astonishment, he asked her to give him the lovely coins before they left. Intrigued, Camille questioned his unexpected generosity, particularly since no one nearby had shown him any kindness. Once again, he referenced a philosopher he admired, Aristotle, saying, "A truly great-hearted person asks for no favor, but is always ready to offer kindness to others." With a hint of regret in his voice, he admitted, "I must strive to be a more generous man because it was my past actions that led me astray." Although Camille was eager to learn more about him, she couldn't pry any further details from him at that moment. Still, she yearned to understand Antoine's story better. Later that evening, as they sat together in the warmly lit dining room enjoying a comforting winter stew, Camille mustered the courage to ask about Antoine's solitude at the chateau. After a brief pause filled with contemplation, Antoine sighed deeply, leaned back in his chair, took a sip of his drink, and began to share his tale. "Years ago," he started, "I lived here with my mother. After my father passed away when I was just a child, I became the lord of this estate. My mother was a radiant soul who spread joy and kindness wherever she went. She lovingly cared for the rose bush that your father stripped of its blossoms." Antoine hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable as he continued. "When my mother fell ill and eventually died, I found myself alone and unprepared. Sadly, I did not rise to meet my responsibilities. Naive and reckless, I wasted our family's fortune on lavish luxuries and extravagant celebrations. The estate fell into disrepair as I ignored debts and mistreated those who worked for me. Without my mother's guiding hand, I descended into a life of indulgence that held no meaning for anyone, not even myself. One fateful evening during one of my grand parties, a servant approached me with news of a woman at our door seeking food and help. Lost in the revelry around me, I coldly dismissed her request and told my servant to send her away in search of work elsewhere. Just as the servant was about to usher her out, she pushed her way in and foretold that my arrogance would lead to my demise, cursing me to live in solitude and without love until I learned compassion and sought redemption. With a furrowed brow, Camille pondered Antoine's words. Humanity? What could she have meant by that? Antoine shrugged, a hint of frustration in his eyes. It's a riddle that has haunted me for years. Even with access to an extensive library brimming with the insights of philosophers, mathematicians, and poets, I find myself ensnared in this curse. My mind expands daily, yet the collective wisdom of humanity hasn't illuminated a path to my liberation. Camille studied him from across the table, her thoughts drifting to the crackling fire that punctuated the stillness around them. She envisioned him sitting alone by many fires over countless nights, without a soul to converse with. How many years had he been confined in this solitary existence, leafing through innumerable books in search of salvation? Antoine flashed a bright smile, attempting to dispel the heavy silence. "Ah, well," he remarked cheerfully, "as the brilliant Isaac Newton once said, to arrive at the simplest truth requires years of contemplation. Perhaps one day I will uncover the answer while she rests quietly on her bed tonight." In that moment, Camille felt clarity wash over her. All these years, Antoine had devoted himself to study and reflection, grappling with his past and seeking redemption. He was no longer a man who would turn away kindness, even from those deemed unworthy. Yet she couldn't help but wonder what else lay within him. Would he remain forever tethered to his books and the dusty relics of his former self? She hoped not. She had grown to admire him deeply. Pulling the cover snugly under her chin, she gazed sleepily at the glowing embers in the hearth. Enveloped in the tranquil silence of their home, she surrendered to slumber for another night. Throughout the biting chill of winter, Camille and Antoine shared their days within the chateau alongside Gabrielle, their steadfast link to the world beyond. Many rooms in the grand mansion remained locked and untouched. The spaces they occupied were warm and tidy, thanks to Camille's diligent care. Their meals were simple, yet nourishing. Outside, snow blanketed the courtyard like a thick white quilt, while chilling winds whispered through deserted hallways. Yet, within those walls, the three inhabitants found solace by the firesides, immersed in their books and each other's company. At long last, the gentle whispers of spring began to grace the land. Camille received a letter from her father, sharing the joyful news that her eldest sister had found a suitor, and their wedding was set to take place in just a few weeks. He kindly inquired whether the Baron might allow her some time off to partake in the celebrations at home. If so, Laurent would be more than happy to come and escort her from the estate. When Camille shared this request with Antoine, he set aside his book, looked at her with a wistful smile, and replied, "Naturally, she must go, and she should take as long as she needs." As she expressed her gratitude for his consent, she once again noticed that she no longer saw a beast staring back at her. Instead, it was simply a man. She had to blink several times to dispel the fleeting illusion. As she turned to leave the room, she paused for a moment, casting one last glance over her shoulder at him. Then she stepped away from him and returned to her thoughts. Her journey to and from her sister's wedding was uneventful. Upon her arrival, her family welcomed her with curious eyes and perhaps a touch of newfound admiration. They admired the elegant new attire she had acquired with her earnings. It was evident that the money she had been sending home had played a significant role in securing her sister's marriage. Although humble in nature, this match elevated their family's standing in the eyes of the villagers. They were no longer seen as impoverished, but rather as stable and respectable due to Camille's steady income. Yet, despite these changes, Camille felt less at home in the family cottage than before. Although confined within the chateau's walls for so long, she sensed that her perspective had shifted and her horizons had broadened immensely. Sitting around the fire with her siblings, who seemed absorbed only in their trivial concerns, she felt stifled. She experienced a twinge of regret at having to leave her father once more. However, relief washed over her when he bid farewell at the gates of Antoine's estate. She was ready to embrace her role as mistress of the house once again, but upon returning, dismay washed over her as she beheld the chaos waiting for her inside. Gabriel greeted her at the door with enthusiasm, clearly thrilled by her return. He leaned in close and whispered that nothing had been quite right since she'd laughed last, that the Baron had become disheveled and hadn't left his library since she departed. After tidying up her belongings, Camille made her way directly to see Antoine. As she gently pushed open the door to the library, a disarray greeted her eyes. Books were scattered everywhere, some lying open in chaotic piles, while others were carelessly tossed about. The floor was littered with empty glasses that cluttered the tables. Antoine sat slouched in a chair, appearing as if he hadn't changed his shirt in ages. The moment he heard her arrive, he looked up, his face reflecting a mix of embarrassment and relief. In that instant, Camille found herself seeing him merely as an ordinary man, and she struggled to reconcile this image with the reality before her. Logically, she understood that she was facing someone unkempt, unshaven, and rather beastly in appearance. Yet somehow, her perception seemed distorted. It took a few moments for her to truly see him again. Yes, there he was, in desperate need of some upliftment. In just a few days, Camille managed to restore order to the chaos. The dust and neglect accumulated over the past weeks were swiftly addressed, and upon her return, the Baron's spirits lifted almost instantly. However, Gabriel confided in her that perhaps she should leave once more. He explained that the Baron had plunged into a deep melancholy and had become utterly incapable of managing anything, even remembering to eat his meals. Yet with spring bursting forth across the estate, it was hard to remain sad for long. Camille was filled with delight, having successfully organized the clearing of the garden before winter's arrival. The courtyard now radiated beauty, showcasing the lovely plants that Antoine's mother had lovingly arranged long ago. A vibrant array of flowers bloomed gracefully, enhancing the charm of their surroundings. Each day, more birds seemed to join in, filling the mornings with their sweet melodies and inviting the residents of the chateau to bask in the garden's tranquility. Camille and Antoine began to savor their afternoons beneath the pergola, often allowing Gabriel to finish his chores early so they could unwind together. Camille also found joy in flinging open the windows of the once stuffy mansion, welcoming fresh air into their home. The estate felt revitalized, as if a new chapter was unfolding in their lives. As summer drew near, Camille received a letter from her father announcing her sister's upcoming wedding. She felt torn between her duty to attend this family celebration and her reluctance to part from Antoine once again. To bridge this conflict, she suggested an unconventional idea. Antoine could accompany her to the wedding and stay at a nearby inn. Initially surprised by this proposal, Antoine voiced his worries about how he would be perceived by others. Camille comforted him, explaining that her village was far away and that the locals wouldn't hold any preconceived notions about him. In her heart, she no longer viewed him as a monster, but rather as the wise and kind man she had come to cherish. She believed that her community would welcome him with open arms. The notion of a nobleman attending a village wedding was not daunting for Camille. She had long since stopped seeing Antoine as a beast or merely a baron. Though hesitant at first, Antoine eventually agreed to join Camille for her sister's special day, not wanting to deprive her of this cherished moment. However, he remained apprehensive during all the preparations. Undeterred by his somber mood, Camille took it upon herself to arrange for Gabriel to visit the tailor in town for a new suit tailored just for Antoine. She had noticed he still wore clothes that belonged to another era. With contemporary fashion favoring cleaner lines and simpler styles, She wanted him to have an outfit that would present him as dignified and modern rather than outdated, a reflection of who he truly was now. The rooms they had occupied were readied, and the carriage sparkled with cleanliness. At last, the day came when Gabriel bid farewell to the couple as they set off on their journey. It was a sight he had never witnessed before, the Baron departing from the estate. He reassured them that he would keep everything in order during their absence. The ride to Camille's village was swift, covering the distance in just a single day, and it happened to be a splendid one. Summer was in full bloom, showcasing its vibrant beauty as the horse trotted along the forest path. Sunlight danced joyfully through the leafy canopy above, casting bright beams onto the road ahead and whispering sweetly in the gentle breeze. At first, Antoine remained quiet, seemingly hesitant about being seen with Camille in public. However, after a few miles, he began discussing a book she had been reading. Before long, their familiar, playful banter returned. Camille smiled to herself, delighted to see his best traits shining through. From her vantage point beside him, she felt as if she were sitting next to a charming gentleman, a thought that brought her joy, and she chose not to break the spell of enchantment. Eventually, their delightful journey came to an end as dusk enveloped them. Crickets began their evening serenade in the fields around them. When they arrived at her family's cottage and stepped down from the carriage, Camille noticed her entire family waiting at the front door. Her 4 unmarried siblings stared at them both with unabashed curiosity. Laurent made an effort to regain his composure and stepped forward to greet Antoine with polite words of thanks for accompanying Camille and honoring them with his presence. Yet Camille felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment when her brother leaned over and whispered something to her older sister that made her giggle. It was clear they were teasing about the Baron. Everyone felt relieved when Antoine took his leave for his lodgings. Camille allowed herself to be guided inside, where she spent the evening chatting with Laurent and her siblings about the wedding preparations, while trying to keep her worries at bay regarding how Antoine was faring at the inn. She hoped fervently that he was not encountering any unkindness there. As she nestled into bed that night, thoughts of him filled her mind like a heavy blanket, wrapping around her as she drifted into sleep. She understood that a sense of relief would wash over her once the wedding was behind them, and they returned to the chateau, which she now embraced as her true home. The atmosphere was heavy when he arrived at the church the next day for the ceremony. Camille's worries had indeed come to fruition. They sat in silence throughout the proceedings, both acutely aware of the weight of every gaze upon them. The small church felt even more confined with the entire congregation watching intently. After the ceremony, the celebration unfolded on the village green. Though modest, it was filled with life. Punch flowed, cakes were shared, and wildflowers adorned the scene. In this cheerful setting, ladies clustered together, savoring delicate sweets while children dashed across the lawn, delighting in an afternoon of carefree play. Yet Camille and Antoine felt a world apart from the merriment surrounding them. She stood stiffly beside him, acknowledging the villagers who had once shown her kindness. Those warm-hearted souls who had taught her about gardening and baking years ago now kept their distance, murmuring among themselves and exchanging knowing glances in her direction. Not a single neighbor offered a kind word to Antoine. He maintained a polite smile but remained silent. Her own family provided no solace, choosing instead to completely overlook the couple. As Camille and Antoine stood there, fervently wishing for the party to come to an end, they caught snippets of a conversation between two men nearby. "You might have wealth," one of them sneered, "but with a face like that, he'll never win anyone's heart." The other man chuckled in agreement, saying, "It's quite unfortunate when you have to woo your own maid." Those remarks were the final straw for Camille. Setting her punch down firmly, she strode confidently to the center of the gathering and declared that she had something important to say, demanding everyone's attention. "I convinced the Baron to join me here because I believed you were good-hearted people," she proclaimed. "I was certain that his noble spirit and kindness would show you all that he is not the monster you think he is. However, I must admit my error. None of you are worthy of his respect. We will no longer impose upon you. Let me be clear. Antoine is a better man than any of you. I would choose him as my companion over each and every one of you 100 times over, and that is the truth." A profound silence enveloped the room as everyone stared in disbelief from Camille to Antoine and back again. When she turned to look at him, she was met with a remarkable sight. Where once stood her dear friend was now a handsome, dignified gentleman, smiling at her with gratitude. No matter how hard she tried to refocus her thoughts and clear her mind, his appearance remained unchanged. The rugged facial hair, striking features, and commanding presence were still there. He was as handsome as any man she had ever known. That much was undeniable. Whether it was a shift in perception or perhaps some kind of enchantment at play, the other guests continued their revelry as if nothing had happened. They greeted Antoine warmly and smiled at Camille as if everything were perfectly normal, behaving as though the embarrassing incident had never occurred at all. It seemed that the villagers had never encountered a beast among them before. It was both a mystery and a marvel. A curtain had been drawn back for good. This serene moment of victory signified Antoine's ultimate liberation from the spell that had bound him. For many years he had searched for answers within the shelves of his library, immersing himself in the wisdom of humanity. Yet he had misinterpreted the intentions of the woman who had cast the curse upon him. The solitary decades spent nurturing kindness, generosity, and forgiveness had blossomed within him the humanity that had won Camille's heart. This newfound essence was the key that shattered his enchantment. Not long after this revelation, Camille and Antoine found themselves together beneath the pergola in his garden, admiring the flourishing rose bush that belonged to his mother, now bursting with vibrant blooms once more. As twilight enveloped the chateau, crickets began their gentle serenade. The joyful couple reveled in the warmth of the summer evening, and Camille gazed at Antoine, her heart swelling as she took in the handsome features that had long been hidden beneath a beastly exterior. As she watched him, he straightened up and pulled from his pocket a ring she had once admired in his mother's dresser. "You were the only one who truly made an effort to understand me," he said softly to her. Then, with a familiar charm, he quoted one of his many beloved books. As Copernicus said, "At the center of everything is the sun. You have become that sun." With a playful wink, he added, "In truth, I believe you have shown yourself more than capable of managing this chateau." Camille chuckled and nodded in agreement as he gently slid the sparkling blue gem onto her finger. Awestruck by its beauty, she recalled the first time she had spotted it in that mysterious bedroom filled with elegant dresses and treasures. It shimmered under the sunlight, as if whispering a cherished secret. Now, she was weaving herself into the very fabric of this estate's history. Before summer's end arrived, Antoine and Camille exchanged their vows in the courtyard of the chateau, surrounded by fragrant blooming roses and sweet melodies from birds perched high in the trees. Standing in the shadow of their home, Camille looked at Antoine with a heart brimming with gratitude. She felt an undeniable sense of belonging in a place that had once felt so foreign to her. This was no longer the bleak estate she had encountered merely a year ago. Through love, patience, and a quest for understanding, she and Antoine had unearthed true happiness together.